David sat in the small, dimly lit waiting room, glancing around at the sparse, somewhat outdated surroundings. A few women's magazines were scattered on a low table next to the chair he was sitting in. The soft sounds of classical music flowed from a speaker mounted above his head. The melody was loud enough to drown out the faint murmurs of voices coming through the wall, but not so loud as to be bothersome. Finally, the door opened. Susan walked in, glancing up at him with a weak, uncertain smile. As their eyes met, David turned his head quickly, averting his gaze from her face. He didn't even try to speak. Despite there being 6 chairs in the room, she chose to sit next to him. "Thank you for coming," Susan said, her voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of nervousness. "I hope Dr. Mars can help us move on." David didn't respond. He remained silent, standing beside his chair, his eyes locked on hers. His cold gaze made it clear to Susan that he didn't believe her, didn't believe anything she had to say. Just as she was about to apologize again, the door to the next room opened. A woman emerged, wiping her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief. She lowered her head as she hurriedly crossed the room and disappeared through the reception door. Moments later, a short, full-figured woman entered from the same inner door and walked toward them. Her brown jumper hung loosely, emphasizing her sagging breasts and bulging tummy. She wore a dated green skirt that reached her mid-calf and unremarkable brown flats that seemed to emphasize her short stature. Her face was expressionless, showing little emotion, and it was clear that she wore little or no makeup. "Mr. and Mrs. Stillwell," she said, her voice flat and almost indifferent. "I'm Fran Marks. Thank you for coming in today. Please come into my office." Without waiting for a response, Dr. Marks turned on her heel and walked back toward her professional space. Susan, who had been watching her with a mixture of hope and doubt, followed Dr. Marks immediately. David, somewhat reluctantly, rose from his chair and followed his wife. When they entered Dr. Marks's office, the mood shifted. Dr. Marks took her seat at the massive table, placing her elbows on the surface and interlocking her fingers. She looked at them both for a moment, her eyes calm and focused. "Let's begin," she said. "So, I understand that the court ordered you to consult because Susan's lawyer requested it after you filed for divorce. David, have I outlined the situation correctly?" Dr. Marks asked, shifting her gaze from one to the other. David and Susan nodded almost in sync. Then Susan stepped forward, her voice almost desperate. "I hope you can persuade David to give up the divorce and come home to me and the children," she blurted out. Dr. Marks nodded graciously, turning her attention to David. "And you, David, why are you here today?" David looked up tiredly at the doctor sitting across from him. "I'm here because the judge said I had to be here," he replied flatly. "I see," Dr. Marks said, tilting her head demurely. "Well, this is the first time we've met today, and we'll be seeing each other here for another 11 sessions. Hopefully, we can resolve some of the issues that have arisen between you and allow you to move forward with your lives in harmony." David said nothing. He just continued to stare at the doctor with a completely blank expression, as if looking through her. Dr. Marks sighed quietly and turned her attention back to Susan. "All right, Susan, why don't you tell me the purpose of your coming here?" Susan readily entered the conversation. "I want David to stop this stupid divorce and come home. I do not want a divorce. His parents, my parents, our children, and our friends all agree that he should stop this stupid divorce and come back to his family, back to our home." Dr. Marks turned to David. "It seems that literally everyone who knows you believes that you should not divorce your wife. Tell me, what made you file for divorce?" David responded softly but firmly. "She said she didn't love me anymore, and I can't be married to a woman who doesn't love me." Susan snorted loudly from her seat. "That's not true. I never said I didn't love him. In fact, I told him many times that I love him." The counselor turned to him. "If Susan says she still loves you, why don't you believe her?" David glanced at Susan with visible disgust before turning back to Dr. Marks. "Actions speak louder than words," he said briefly. But I didn't do anything, Susan whispered, on the verge of tears. David crossed his arms over his chest, his tone even colder now. Bye, he said, narrowing his eyes. Fran raised her eyebrows in bewilderment. David raised his left wrist a little closer to his face. Glancing at his Apple Watch with his right index finger, he tapped it a few times expressively and then spoke. It was 5 weeks ago, Friday night. He began. I came home from work, and He jerked his chin toward his wife, who was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine, waiting for me. It took me about 20 seconds to realize something was wrong. She said we needed to talk and asked me to sit down at the table. I splashed myself a small drink and sat down across from her. Then she told me that she had already agreed to a date with another man and was going out with him the next night. Not only that, she also said that if Saturday's date went well and she liked everything about it, she might not come home until Sunday. David paused for a moment, then looked directly at Dr. Marks. So, Dr. Marks, that was the news waiting for me when I got home on Friday night. David's voice was steady but tinged with frustration. Okay, I may not be the sharpest knife in the world, but even I could figure out what that meant. In that moment, I realized that if my wife was planning to spend the night with another man, it meant she no longer loved me. Susan almost immediately whined offensively. But I didn't do anything. I didn't go on a date, and I didn't sleep with anyone, and you left me and filed for divorce even though I didn't do anything. How many times do I have to say it? David remained unmoved by her words. Dr. Marks, trying to guide the conversation, intervened. Is that true, David? Susan says she didn't go on a date and she didn't cheat on you. If that's true, why did you file for divorce? David responded with a simple intent. Dr. Marks looked puzzled. Intent? David nodded firmly. Exactly. Intent. She intended to sleep with some guy, and she expected me to just let her. After I packed up and left, she now claims she canceled the date and has been trying to find me all weekend. Dr. Marks raised her eyebrows. Do you have any reason to believe that's not true? I don't know, David said coldly, and it doesn't matter. All I know is that she definitely intended to sleep with someone else because I wasn't enough for her anymore. Susan, hearing this, shrieked, I never said that. David responded with icy calm. You didn't have to say it verbally. Your intention screamed it right in my face, humiliating me. Dr. Marks, trying to regain control of the situation and end the escalating confrontation, intervened once more. I understand why Susan's offer upset you, Dr. Marks began, her tone soft but firm, but she really didn't go through with it. When she saw that you didn't approve, she turned down the date. Certainly. Your wife deserves credit for that. David pressed his lips together, shook his head. Seems to me that's like saying I deserve credit for not robbing the bank next door, he replied, pausing for effect. It was clear from his expression that Dr. Marks was still not fully grasping his point. David decided to elaborate. Look, if I planned the robbery, prepared the getaway car, bought the mask, wrote an ultimatum note to the teller and handed it to her, then I suppose it shows my clear intention to rob the bank. Then after reading the note, the teller simply says no, and I run out of there. But no matter how I look at it, I'm still guilty of attempted bank robbery. Dr. Marks leaned back in her chair, her frown deepening as she absorbed what David had said. She turned to Susan briefly, then back to David, shaking her head slowly. After a moment, she spoke. I've been doing this for 17 years and have heard similar arguments many times, she said, her voice more reflective now. Until now. Each time I've tried to defend a spouse who has backed away from his plans to cheat because in the end, he has remained faithful to the marriage. Now I'm struggling to find flaws in your reasoning, David, but I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not making legal judgments. However, I do know that the intent to rob a bank is itself a criminal offense, even if you didn't manage to get any of the bank's money. David nodded, visibly pleased that Dr. Marks could now understand the reasoning behind his decision to file for divorce. Susan, clearly worried and confused, shifted her gaze from her husband to the doctor. "Well, what's going on?" she whispered, her voice anxious. "What does a bank robbery have to do with our problem?" Fran raised her hand, signaling for attention. "Please explain this to her," she said to David. David nodded, his tone calm but resolute. "Susan, you've taken the time to get to know your new mate better. You've probably had lunch together a few times, maybe more than a few. You developed an interest in him that eventually grew into a sexual interest. This interest led you to agree to go on a date with him. When you agreed to the date, you were fully aware of what his intentions were. You're a grown woman, and you know what that means." Susan opened her mouth to protest, but David held up a hand to continue. "You were so sure of his intentions that you felt it necessary to tell me about the upcoming date, as well as the fact that you would probably spend the night with him. By doing so, you once again confirmed your intention to follow through with his plans. In other words, you confirmed your intention to sleep with another man." He paused, his gaze never leaving Susan. "The fact that you canceled the date," his voice trailed off, as if the words were no longer necessary. The meaning had already been made clear. Dr. Marks looked back at Susan, as if waiting for her response. But Susan said nothing. The weight of the conversation hung heavy in the air. David's voice was firm yet tinged with sadness. "I objected, but that doesn't change your previous intentions. I believe that if you loved me the way I loved you, there's no way you would have agreed to a date with another man. But alas, you agreed to go on this date, which means you can't love me the way I loved you. I'm sorry, Susan, but I can't be married to someone who doesn't love me enough to stay away from men with similar intentions." Susan lowered her head, and sobs began to rack her body. David, his heart heavy but resolute, rose from his seat. Dr. Marks stood as well, extending her hand to him. "Thank you for coming today," she said, her tone professional yet empathetic. "I will let the judge know that there is no need for additional sessions for you." She then turned to Susan, still sobbing in her chair. Gently, she placed a hand on her shoulder. "I guess I'll have to spend a little more time with your wife, though." The air in the room was thick with tension as David, after one last glance at his wife, walked out.